In the name of God, who creates, who redeems, and who sustains. Please be seated. To begin, I assume you, like me, look at your phone in the morning, and there's some pretty bad news on those phones this morning. There was a shooting in Orlando at a nightclub, which we only figured out recently in my phone was a gay nightclub. 50 people are dead, 50. 53 people are injured. And if you engage social media at all, you probably see people checking in as safe on Facebook and not, and people posting that they're looking for their friends. It's a horrible morning. The readings sort of address it, but I thought not completely. Where we are as a nation, so the man that walked in with an assault weapon and a handgun. Where we are as a nation with guns is really complicated. But what guns do in urban places and inside buildings where 300 people are dancing at 2 a.m. is now clear. It was 3 hours of shooting, 3 hours before the police were able to stop this. 3 hours of police that looked like they were in a militarized zone in a war that we were fighting far away before they could stop this man. Can you imagine? 3 hours is longer than you will probably sit here today, I guess depending on how long I stand up here. But 3 hours in a room a lot like this, frankly, full of young people. I can't imagine. I hope none of us can imagine. It makes it among the top 3 of the most deadly shootings in this country in modern history. The others were Virginia Tech and Newtown, Connecticut. Horrible, horrible stories that we are all so used to. That you, like me, probably saw the 20 first thing in the morning and kept going because you had to get here, and then saw it open up into more and more and more, and I bet the numbers will be more by the time we leave this afternoon. It could be different. What I had planned to talk to you about, and I guess what I'll try to talk to you about, is these readings that we have in front of us today, which tell us about the strangeness of God and the utter strangeness of what the kingdom or the reign of God is like. And it is nothing like what we think justice is. So first, this gospel. What could it possibly mean to be this woman, this sinner? Now, you, like me, probably thought right away of a bunch of things she could have done to be this sinner, a famous sinner, but really, when you think about it, what would it be? In the prayer book, it used to say in the old prayer book and at parts of the prayer book that there was a time when those with notorious sin should leave. Do you remember that? I can't be the oldest person in the room. Right, there's one back there, right? And it says in the prayer book that priests may deny communion to notorious sinners. We have someone notorious in sin in some way in the reading today, and she is the star of the show. So who was she? And was she like Jezebel? We also read today about Jezebel, of Ahab and Jezebel. It's kind of interesting in our culture is that we all sort of know who Jezebel is. Even if you don't know the details of that story, you know, one, if you call someone a Jezebel or someone is called a Jezebel, that's bad. Well, here's where it comes from. She is a bad woman. She is a trickster. She tells Ahab when he doesn't get what he wants to man up and be the king. And then he gets him what he wants. She does it in such a way that his life will end because of it, and it will be in a horrible way. But Ahab gets what Ahab wants for a while, a vegetable garden. Now that's strange. Why would anyone take a thriving vineyard and replace it with a vegetable garden? Now, I know we all love our vegetables here at Trinity Church, but those children of Israel and their kings were people just like us. And in our world, vegetables are really nice, but wine beats string beans every time. So is Ahab just petty and ridiculous? Yes, and Ahab is a bad king. This has already been made clear in this book. But bad does not have to equal foolish. So what's actually going on? Well, some biblical scholars say that vegetable gardens are written as the memory of Egypt. When the people of Israel are unhappy with the way things are going, the vegetable gardens, the gardens of Egypt are what they remember. And it's a reminder of one way to run things here on earth. Egypt was a place of refuge for the children of Israel that becomes the place of slavery, the place from which the Hebrew people require liberation, and for liberation, they require God. The man who dares to refuse the king, this Naboth, and you can tell that's not going to go well for him, Naboth cites the law of Moses, the rights of the people to share the land before there were kings in Israel. What he cites are the old ways, the ways that God gives them directly in their story, the dying ways of the dying nation of Israel at the time, about to be swallowed up and its people exiled. It is into this context that the great prophet Elijah, he of the poor pastoral skills, emerges to proclaim God's righteousness so boldly. The king will die as he has had Naboth put to death. And then Elijah flees for his own safety. It's interesting that what we take from this passage is not that all people have a right to a share of the land, because that's huge. It's a big, big idea, and clearly biblical. God is on the side of Naboth. We do not remember from this passage that God calls the people of Israel to be the people of God, governed differently than their neighbors, a different kind of state, in an economy of giftedness and blessing. We don't remember that. No, what we take as the culture from this story is the name Jezebel, this woman, a woman that cannot be trusted. I wonder why that is, that that's all we take from this. In Luke chapter 7, Jesus has just returned the dead to life out of pity and love. This is what happens right before these readings. And before that, he's healed the slave of the centurion. You heard this a couple of weeks ago. The slave boy so beloved that his boss goes off to see if he can save his life. Jesus has entered the world of truly bizarre actions in this part of Luke, for which we as Christians really don't know what to do with. And Jesus has just said of himself that he is called a drunkard and a glutton by the people around him. The Pharisee that has brought him in for dinner has brought a man of great scandal to his very respectable table. And the spectacle, and it is a spectacle that begins to unfold, is that a woman known to all in the assembly comes in bearing a beautiful vessel of alabaster, and it is filled with a lovely perfumed ointment. So in all of the Gospels, a version of this story is told. It happens at different times in the life of Jesus, sometimes right before his death, but it always happens. It's important enough that we hear it every time we hear the story of Jesus. In this version, which is unique in Luke, she weeps, it says, her tears falling onto his feet where she must have fallen or had really, really long hair, because she is then wiping his feet with her hair, anointing his feet with this costly oil produced from an exquisite vessel, and kissing his feet. It is decadent and bizarre. In no place would it not be just very strange. Maybe in the palace of a king, or the table of a man or woman of great wealth, or a high-end palace of entertainment, like a nightclub of some kind, it might be a little less unusual. Maybe, but it's still pretty strange. And we don't hear a lot about those kinds of places in the Gospels anyway. Jesus' life is much more simple. Jesus hung out with serious people, like Pharisees, who care about how they wash their hands and when they pray and who they eat with and who they touch. She sounds like someone who would be accompanied by music and have really beautiful clothes. The gospel never says if anyone was attractive, but you can sort of guess that she should have been a very attractive person. The Bible is not shy about naming women or men for what they do. I think our cultural assumption is that she is a prostitute, but it actually doesn't say that. There are prostitutes in the Bible, and we are told. If she was a foreigner, that would have been considered sinful as well. And the text would probably have told us, as it does for others, and it doesn't. Was she in collusion with Rome in some way? What was her sin? Was she a thief? Did she not honor her parents or covet in some really visible way? What kind of sin would leave her free from punishment and with such a beautiful object and this great reputation in their town? The one big sinner we know among the disciples is the tax collector. He's sort of the sinningest of sinners, Matthew. Was she one of these? Notorious, she was famous. I wonder what she was famous for. Was she brash? A victim of violence? That makes you famous. Did she trade in people? Did she loan money at interest? Did she exploit the poor? Did she have an offshore account in their version of Panama? Maybe she was a musician or a poet. They're also considered pretty scandalous. Or a glutton or drunkard like Jesus has just said that he has been called. Or maybe she was a cultural critic. Or maybe she was just a woman. For that's how sin often really works. No one is notorious for not being kind enough to their parents, usually, or neglecting many of those other good commandments, except maybe in a small religious circle. But think of who we make notorious in society. You can be too much of many things. You can be too much of a woman, too black, too queer, notoriously so even. If there is societal or corporate justice, then there is societal or corporate sin. And the Bible talks about sin in that way. Elijah proclaims that society should be ordered to be just and righteous and generous, not just a playground for the most powerful. And he proclaims it because it is not yet true. So if that's the case, then it follows that some people and how we organize our society become sinners by default. Whole categories of people, and sometimes it's who we target in violence. And these sinners have to prove their innocence, and others, whole categories of people, are perpetually innocent and have to be proven or convicted of sin or wrongdoing. And even then, their innocence, their humanity, their blessedness is always seen first. Now, I don't think it's ever wrong to see anyone's humanity first, but that has to apply to everyone. Like the tenderness of the sorrow of this woman, the salt of her tears falling on Jesus' feet, and the kisses of adoration designed to show tenderness or to rise up tenderness in us to see her. Recognition and humanity is for everyone. And it will challenge us like the scene we have before us today, when we are called to account for our individual and collective failure. We too are sinners. So I wonder if that is what had happened to her. I wonder what hint there is that I can't find in Luke that tells us what she saw that drew her to this man Jesus. Was it a teaching or a healing? Did she see the love in his eyes for the poor widow or for the centurion? Had she heard among the powerful of the plot to crucify him? Was she terrified for him? We don't know. What were her tears for? And who was this Jesus we claim to love? That such a strange touch, long and probably sensuous, scandalous, and awkwardly witnessed by many, was received with compassion. Did he already know her? Who was this man that we say we follow, whose death we commemorate, and whose resurrection we look to for life? I think sometimes we barely know him at all. We quite literally put on also our serious faces for the cameras here and line up and sit in these austere benches. We're very Simon-like in most churches, and listen intently for the good news of salvation from our teacher. We stop the interruptions at the door, and even our most joyous responses are carefully choreographed to be performed by those who do that kind of thing very, very well on our behalf. But friends, we have invited Jesus to come among us, as Simon did, and we are quite literally about to plead with Jesus to be right here and with us. And when we do, I suspect we will also always see something like that woman, gorgeous and uninvited, with gifts too extravagant for this thing that we are doing here. The one with eyes filled with tears and gifts greater than we can afford, that falls at his feet today to anoint our freedom. Yes, our freedom. It's interesting to talk about freedom in a country where freedom means things like the freedom to carry a gun, but I mean real freedom. This is what salvation is, and it's a word we shouldn't give away because some parts of our nation use it in a particular way. The work of our salvation is freedom. Now, I don't want to abstract this very physical story, but freedom is what this is about. Lord knows now we could all learn to love bodies more, and this is about bodies as well, and this lesson takes us there. All the parts of all of our own bodies, and I'm as guilty as any, that we try to starve or control or tame, we know from Oprah that that doesn't work. The body always wins, and maybe we just should let it. And if we did, could we love bodies like this woman, and Simon the uptight Pharisee, and Matthew the corrupt tax collector, and the powerful centurion and his special friend in need of healing, and the young widow who watches her child die? Could we love the women that tell us they have been raped, 1 in 4 in this country, refugees fleeing wars whose bodies leak from repeated attack, bodies like yours and mine, bodies crossing borders as victims, refugees on the Mexico side and criminals by definition on the US side, 2 of whom were the valedictorians of their high school classes in Texas this year, bravely coming out of the shadows to the rage of so many Simons who will this very morning come to the table with Jesus. Could we love women at all, you have to wonder? And I think we will be challenged to consider this in the election contest that seems to be shaping up. Regardless of how you plan to vote or who you hoped would be nominated, we will be talking about women in the same way that Barack Obama's nomination and elections meant we talked about race a lot more. So part of that was because the president named some of the daily humiliations and violations of people of color from his very powerful platform. But it was also in part because of the capacity in social media to make news that traditional media does not consider newsworthy. Things like Sandra Bland's death, or frankly, the shooting this morning, as soon as it was happening, you could follow it on Twitter from 2 o'clock this morning, from people hiding in bathrooms. And because what had been left unsaid about race in our public national narrative got said about the Obamas, really ugly stuff, forced us to decide who we were. Did we see a new day in America in our first family, whether we thought the president was too liberal or too conservative? Or did we just see our own racism? I predict, and you should know about me that I only predict the obvious, that this election will have the same effect. We have been talking about women and violence, like race, because women and girls, the people affected by bias and violence, have been speaking up in forums that can now be seen and shared, and women are in the front of this race. And the blowback is fierce, and we will continue to see it. It will force us to decide who we are. And as with race, we are being exposed to something that is latent and evil and sinful. Yes, evil, like the comforts of Egypt, where the people of Israel were enslaved, but remembered with fondness that it was a simpler time with very nice vegetable gardens. It is for the vineyards of Canaan, those trampling of vineyards, where the grapes of wrath are stored, we sing, that we are made. But God is strange, and so is God's justice. It is not just vineyards for the winners of the game. It is not for the conquerors to plant vegetable gardens. It is always in our tradition for the foreigner and the outsider, the sinner and the woman, the conquered, the striver, and the slave. God's justice is not sensible. God's table will always have the one who is just too much at it, in drag or of ambiguous gender or creative gender expression, gluttons and drunkards and fools like us with God-given bodies and passions. Some of us will come with really nice stuff that we want to share, that we bring in spectacular vessels, and most of us are simply hungry for a place at this table. And some of us have the gall to believe that we are the hosts at this table of the Lord, this table whose graces you will not believe. Amen.